So the Browns put out workout photos this week. That's it. That's the news. And I realize how underwhelming that sounds. I genuinely do. But I need you to look at those photos with me for a second, because what's inside them and what's conspicuously absent from them is telling a story that no press conference, no insider report, and no carefully worded organizational statement has managed to tell as clearly. A picture, in this case, is doing exactly what that expression promises. Shedeur Sanders was in those photos, present, working, engaged, alongside a legitimate cross-section of his Cleveland Browns teammates on a morning when every single person in that building had the full legal and contractual right to be somewhere else entirely. Deshaun Watson wasn't there. Dillon Gabriel wasn't there. Just Shedeur, surrounded by offensive linemen and wide receivers and defensive players and specialists, real NFL players with real roster standing, not fringe guys fighting for practice squad spots, all choosing to spend their voluntary time in the same building as their quarterback, the only quarterback who came. Now, I want to be precise about this, because precision matters when you're drawing conclusions from limited information. Voluntary means voluntary. The absence of any player from an optional session doesn't automatically constitute a character indictment or a declaration of competitive surrender. There are legitimate explanations, scheduling conflicts, rehabilitation protocols, personal circumstances that have nothing to do with hunger or commitment or how seriously someone is taking a competition. I acknowledge that completely. But here's the thing. Acknowledging the possibility of innocent explanations doesn't obligate me to pretend the contrast isn't striking. It is striking. It's striking in a specific contextual way that becomes more significant the more carefully you examine the surrounding circumstances. And that's exactly what I want to do. The most important thing to understand about voluntary off-season sessions, and I think this gets missed constantly in NFL coverage, is that the value of showing up has almost nothing to do with the actual football work that gets done. The reps help, the conditioning matters, the film study is useful, but none of that is the primary reason a player in a quarterback competition makes the choice to walk through that door when no one is requiring him to. The primary reason is relational and reputational. You show up to a voluntary session because you're building something that cannot be built any other way. A specific kind of organizational credibility that accumulates through exactly these small, unforced, individually insignificant choices. The offensive lineman who arrived at 7 a.m. and saw Shedeur already there, that moment matters. The receiver who's been running routes in the offseason and finds the quarterback throwing to him without being told to, that interaction matters. The defensive veteran who's going to face this quarterback in practice every day through training camp and is forming his first real impression of who this person is as a competitor. That first impression matters. None of it shows up in any statistical database. All of it shapes how a locker room thinks and talks about its quarterback in the private conversations that coaching staffs listen to more carefully than they'll ever admit publicly. Shedeur has been stacking these moments. That's the thing I keep coming back to when I step back from any individual piece of news and look at the full picture of how this offseason has unfolded. The voluntary workout is one data point, but it's one data point that lands on top of months of other data points, all pointing in the same direction. Every report from people with genuine facility access about how he's preparing, every coaching staff signal about rep distribution and system installation, every veteran teammate who has attached their name, their actual name, not an anonymous impression, to a public statement about their confidence in him. The pattern is consistent to a degree that I think demands more recognition than the noise around this situation has allowed it to receive. Let me talk about Watson specifically, because I think the honest version of this analysis requires engaging with his situation directly rather than just cataloging the contrast and moving on. He's been public about his physical condition. The social media content he's put out shows a man moving well, the kind of movement that suggests his Achilles recovery has progressed to something approaching competitive readiness. If I take that at face value, if I accept that he is in fact physically capable of participating in a voluntary session, then I'm left trying to construct a football logic that explains his absence. And I've genuinely tried to build that case. I can't. Here's the reality Watson is operating inside right now. Every credible report about the internal direction of this franchise has been describing a coaching staff whose commitment to Shedeur is solidifying by the week, an owner whose resistance to that direction hasn't produced any visible reversal of it, and an organizational picture that is pointing away from him with increasing clarity. When that is your specific competitive situation, not some hypothetical generic competition, but this specific one at this specific moment, the voluntary versus mandatory distinction stops being the relevant framework for your decisions. The relevant framework is, what does it actually take to shift an organizational evaluation that is already moving against me? And the answer to that question never includes skipping sessions that your competition is attending. The version of Deshaun Watson who thrived in Houston, who earned his Pro Bowls, who commanded the market that brought him to Cleveland in the first place, that player understood competitive investment at a cellular level. He wouldn't have needed anyone to explain the optics of this. His absence sends a message whether he intended to send it or not, and the message doesn't help his case. I want to be fair though. I really do. There's a version of this where Watson has medical guidance we don't know about. There's a version where something personal or logistical created a genuine conflict that had nothing to do with his competitive posture. I'm not dismissing those possibilities, but the Cleveland Browns' organizational communication choices don't give those possibilities much oxygen. They released content from this session. They documented who was there. Last year, when Gabriel attended similar sessions, they put out content featuring him. The deliberate choice of what to show and what not to show is itself a form of organizational statement, and the statement they made with these photos is not subtle. Gabriel's situation, when I examine it carefully, actually reads quite differently from Watson's, even though the surface outcome, not being in the building, is identical. The reporting around Gabriel has been consistently pointing toward a player who has absorbed the full weight of the organizational signals and arrived at a conclusion about his future that has less to do with competition and more to do with direction. A quarterback who is actively seeking a trade, who has concluded, based on everything he's seen and heard from inside that facility, that the organizational investment is firmly and finally pointed elsewhere, isn't going to walk into a voluntary workout with the energy and presence and competitive engagement that such a session demands. And I'm not judging him for that. If the signals from your organization are telling you clearly that your role here is being defined by someone else's development and your genuine professional opportunity is going to materialize somewhere other than this building, the mentally and emotionally healthy response is to start orienting toward that somewhere else. Whether Cleveland finds the right trade partner at the right value is a separate, complicated question that will take time to resolve. But Gabriel's absence from this workout, read in its full context, feels less like competitive indifference and more like a situation that has already reached its private conclusion, even if the public announcement is still pending. Now, I want to slow down and really sit inside what was happening in that building, because I think the relational dimension of this story is being significantly underappreciated. When I look at the roster composition of who showed up alongside Shedeur, I'm not looking at a collection of young players with roster spots to fight for, all motivated by survival instincts to make favorable impressions. I'm looking at Zion Johnson, an established offensive lineman, Mason Graham, one of the most significant defensive investments this franchise has made, Jerry Jeudy, a veteran wide receiver with career production and professional standing who had absolutely zero competitive reason to be in that building and walked in anyway, KT Leviston, Isaiah Bond, Darnell Washington, Quincy Williams, the kicker and punter. These are real NFL players making real choices about how to spend real time, and they chose to spend it in the same voluntary session as their quarterback. Think about what gets constructed in a room like that. Not on the field, and that's almost secondary. What gets constructed in the informal spaces, in the conversations between reps, in the weight room, in the film session, in the car ride home. The linemen who are going to be the last line of protection between Shedeur and defensive ends who want to end his season are building a personal relationship with him in a low-pressure setting before the full intensity of training camp compresses all those relationship-building opportunities into a much tighter, much higher stakes window. The receivers who are going to need to trust his arm and his decisions in crucial moments are developing the kind of chemistry that you can't manufacture under a mandatory schedule, but that emerges naturally when people spend unhurried voluntary time together. And all of that is happening around Shedeur, specifically, only around Shedeur, because Watson and Gabriel weren't there to be part of any of it. The relationships being built in that room are his relationships. The credibility being accumulated is his credibility. That asymmetry is going to matter when training camp opens and the formal evaluation begins, because the formal evaluation doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens inside a locker room whose informal architecture has already been shaped by everything that came before it. I think about Todd Monken and what I understand about how he actually evaluates players, and the voluntary session tells a story that fits his philosophy so precisely it almost seems designed to. Monken, by every account of people who have worked under him, operates on a single consistent standard: what you demonstrate every day. Not what you did in a previous system for a previous staff. Not what your contract says about your value, or what the draft capital attached to acquiring you implies about organizational expectations. What you show up and demonstrate in this building, today, in this competition, for this team. Watson's $44.9 million cap number is an organizational fact that carries real financial and reputational weight. In Monken's evaluation framework, it doesn't buy a single rep of organizational trust. That trust is earned exclusively through the daily accumulation of demonstrated investment. And the daily accumulation has been running lopsided for long enough now that I think most of the people inside that facility know how it ends. The part of me that wants to be careful and measured says, don't declare conclusions that the evidence hasn't fully delivered yet. Training camp hasn't happened. Preseason games haven't been played. The formal competition will run its course, and I genuinely believe it needs to run its course before any definitive proclamation is made. I hold that position sincerely. But the part of me that has been watching this situation develop across an entire offseason, tracking every available piece of genuine information against the noise that's been generated around it, looks at this week's voluntary workout and sees not a new development so much as a confirmation of something that has been building and compounding for months. NFL starting jobs aren't won in a single decisive moment. They're assembled through an extended process of small demonstrations that collectively answer a question the coaching staff is always quietly asking: who, when it truly matters, shows up? Shedeur Sanders, on a morning when nobody required him to be there, surrounded by teammates who also chose to be there, answered that question with his presence. The competition answered it with their absence. And in Todd Monken's building, operating on Todd Monken's standard, that answer carries exactly as much weight as you'd expect it to. The photos will cycle out of the news in a day or two, replaced by the next development in a situation that has been generating continuous developments all off-season. But the day those photos document will still have happened. The relationships built in that room will still exist. The credibility accumulated through one more voluntary choice will still be part of the foundation. And when Shedeur Sanders eventually jogs out onto a Cleveland Browns field as the unambiguous starter, which I believe is where this is heading, and the evidence has been pointing that way for a long time, nobody in the stands will be thinking about an off-season workout session. But inside that locker room, the people who were in that building with him will remember. The offensive lineman who saw him there, the receiver who threw routes with him, the veteran who formed his first real impression of his quarterback on a morning when the quarterback didn't have to be there and came anyway. Those memories are the invisible infrastructure underneath everything that follows, and Shedeur Sanders has been building them, one voluntary morning at a time, since the day he arrived.